Elliot felt he was born for monotony. His life in the bowl, as they called that small village tucked inside a mountain, was a repetitive cycle of days that passed without major events. Although his aunt and uncle, Harold and Margaret, treated him with affection, he had always felt something was missing. Or perhaps it was the opposite, something in the bowl was superfluous, a persistent sense that the place held secrets no one wanted to discuss. The walls of the bowl rose like a natural fortress, creating a world apart. Inside, everything seemed suspended in time. The wooden houses, many of them old, were built around the lake that snaked its way from the heart of the bowl and disappeared into a tunnel to the north. The school, the temple, and the market were located in the center, slightly elevated on a hill. From there, one could see the entire village, as well as the imposing stone faces carved into the walls. These faces were enormous, each representing an animal, a fox, an owl, a deer, and a wolf. Though their features were simple, they seemed to observe everything. The younger villagers mocked the superstitions surrounding the carvings, but the elders maintained a reverential respect for them. As a child, Elliot often dreamed of the faces. In his dreams, they moved and spoke, but their words were always incomprehensible, as if they used a forgotten language. These dreams often coincided with the end-of-year festival, a celebration that Elliot found both fascinating and terrifying. The bowl had its own stories, passed down in murmurs and whispers, as if the storytellers themselves feared they might be more real than they dared admit. It was said that the village was founded by travelers seeking refuge but found something else instead. One of the most repeated legends spoke of an ancient god that dwelled in the mountain. It was an animal god, a being both protective and demanding. The stone faces were, supposedly, representations of its different aspects: cunning, wisdom, strength, and vigilance. According to the tale, the village's founders made a pact with this god. In exchange for its protection, the villagers were to pay homage at the end of each year, offering tributes and respect. Elliot didn't believe these stories. But there were unsettling details he couldn't ignore. For instance, the feeling that the stone faces were watching him, even when he wasn't directly looking at them. And then there were the whispers. He wasn't the only one who had heard them. Many claimed that on certain nights, when the wind howled fiercely, voices could be heard emanating from the stone walls. Some villagers spoke of disappearances. Always near the festival dates. People who seemed to vanish overnight, and whom no one appeared to remember the next day. The dawn of the festival day always brought a sense of anticipation and bustle to the bowl. Though the celebration turned solemn at nightfall, the morning and afternoon were a whirlwind of activity. From the early hours, the streets filled with merchants arriving from the farthest corners of the village and even from beyond the mountains. Despite the isolation imposed by the bowl, its market was renowned for the variety of goods and the quality of the items offered there. Elliot always found this day particularly exhausting. Margaret, usually the driving force behind their stall, managed it with near-military precision. That morning, while he was still yawning and stretching, his aunt was already loading boxes and inspecting their merchandise. Elliot didn't believe these stories. But there were unsettling details he couldn't ignore. For instance, the feeling that the stone faces were watching him, even when he wasn't directly looking at them. And then there were the whispers. He wasn't the only one who had heard them. Many claimed that on certain nights, when the wind howled fiercely, voices could be heard emanating from the stone walls.
Come on, Elliot, we don't have all day,
she said with a smile, shoving a stack of trays toward him.
It's too early for this much energy,
he muttered, still half asleep.
It's the end of year festival. What did you expect? Besides, this is the best day to sell. Everyone wants something special to bid farewell to the year.
Harold was already at the market when they arrived, busy setting up tables and arranging the carved figures he had spent months crafting. His rough, precise hands carefully placed each piece, from small wooden animals to decorative utensils. Elliot noticed that his uncle worked in silence, with an almost reverent focus. Harold rarely spoke during the festival. The market, perched on a raised plaza in the center of the bowl, was already alive with activity. Merchants called out their deals, and early buyers strolled between the stalls. The air, crisp with the morning cold, was filled with mingling scents, spices, freshly baked bread, and ripe fruit. As he helped Margaret arrange trays of sweets, Elliot couldn't help but notice a shift in the atmosphere. The merchants' conversation seemed more hushed, more tense than in previous years. Though everyone tried to appear cheerful, there was something in their eyes, a barely contained worry.
They say this year will be different.
He overheard a man at a neighboring stall say.
What do you mean?
His companion asked.
The faces, they seem alive. I don't know how to explain it. Like they're waiting for something.
Elliot tried to ignore the remark, but the man's words stuck in his mind. He glanced up at the stone carvings dominating the bowl's horizon. Even in broad daylight, the faces seemed to cast an invisible shadow over the village.
Is something bothering you, Elliot?
Margaret asked, noticing his distraction.
No. It's just... Have you looked at the faces? Don't they seem different to you?
Margaret turned toward the carvings and frowned.
Don't be superstitious. They're just stone. Although...
She paused briefly, as if considering saying more, but quickly changed the subject.
Here, take this to the counter. We have customers waiting.
As the morning wore on, Elliot found himself carrying boxes, moving trays, and serving customers with an efficiency that felt almost mechanical. Yet his mind remained distracted, unable to shake off what he had overheard earlier. While weaving through the stalls to fetch some change, he came across an elderly woman known in the village for her eccentric stories. She sat on a low stool, her gray scarf wrapped around her head, and a sharp, knowing expression on her face.
Elliot, come here, boy.
She called, her voice low and whispery. Elliot hesitated, surprised that she recognized him.
Yes? Do you need something?
Be careful tonight. Her tone wasn't one of warning, but of certainty. When the bells toll, keep your eyes open. The things that disappear always leave traces.
Before he could respond, the woman stood and melted into the crowd, leaving Elliot frozen in place, a chill creeping down his spine. When he returned to the stall, Margaret was in the middle of an animated argument with Harold, something about the number of sweets they needed to sell before the procession began. But when Margaret saw him, her expression softened.
Everything okay, Elliot?
Yeah, just had a strange encounter. Nothing important.
Margaret studied him for a moment longer than usual but chose not to press the matter. As the sun began its descent, the market transformed. The laughter and chatter gave way to an expectant silence. Merchants started packing up their goods, clearing space for the procession that would mark the beginning of the evening ceremony. Margaret was giving the stall one last inspection while Harold gathered the few wooden figures that hadn't been sold.
Elliot, help your uncle with those boxes, will you?
Margaret said, gesturing toward some empty crates they'd used to transport their merchandise. As Elliot carried the boxes to the cart, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He glanced around, looking for Margaret, but she was nowhere in sight.
Where's Margaret?
He asked Harold, who was busy securing the carved figures.
What are you talking about, boy? It's just been you and me all day. Now hurry up and finish packing.
The response chilled him to the bone. Harold spoke with an unsettling naturalness, as if he truly believed what he was saying. Elliot turned to the now empty stall, where Margaret had been just minutes ago, but all he found was an inexplicable void, a silence so profound it filled him with a gnawing, muted terror. As the sun began to set, the temple bells rang out across the bowl. The crowd gathered in the center of the market, where the monks emerged, carrying the statue of the animal god. It was an unsettling figure, about 2 meters tall, with the body of a fox, spiraling horns, and hollow eyes that seemed to absorb all light. The procession moved slowly, illuminated by torches. The monks walked barefoot, their steps echoing against the stone ground. The shadows cast by the torches seemed alive, twisting into impossible shapes across the walls of the bowl. Elliot felt a knot tighten in his stomach. With every step the monks took, the air seemed to grow heavier. Harold continued dismantling the stall, his focus unbroken, but Margaret was still missing.
Aunt Margaret?
Elliot asked, his voice tinged with unease as he scanned the crowd, searching for her.
Where are you, Aunt?
He asked again, louder this time.
What aunt are you talking about?
Harold replied, not even looking up from his task.
And seriously, who is Margaret, Elliot?
Elliot wanted to press the issue, to demand answers, but the words died in his throat. The procession continued, the shadows lengthened, and the crowd's murmurs faded into a silence that seemed to stretch infinitely. Back at home, the sense of unreality refused to leave him. Harold acted as though everything was normal, but Elliot couldn't ignore Margaret's absence. He went straight to the living room and opened the bureau where the family photos were kept. As he looked through them, a wave of panic struck him. Margaret was gone from the pictures. In Harold's wedding photo, where she should have been by his side, there was only empty space. Even in recent photos, where the three of them had posed together, only Harold and Elliot remained. He raced upstairs, his heart pounding. He threw open the wardrobe where Margaret's dresses were always kept. It was empty. The kitchen, too, was missing the utensils she always used. Elliot sat down on the bed, trying to steady his breathing. But the house felt wrong, colder, emptier. It was as if Margaret had never existed. From his bedroom window, Elliot gazed out at the lake. Its surface reflected the remaining lights from the market, but something else caught his eye. A long, shadowy figure moved beneath the water, its outline eerily resembling the animal god from the statue. He stepped back from the window, his heart pounding. The echo of the temple bells still lingered in his ears, mingling with a strange murmur, a sound like someone whispering from within the walls. For a moment, he considered waking Harold. But something told him it would be pointless. Harold didn't remember Margaret, and he likely wouldn't remember anything Elliot tried to explain. The next morning, the village was calm. The festivities were over, and everyone had returned to their routines. No one mentioned Margaret. When Elliot tried to bring her up, the villagers gave him puzzled looks.
You've always lived with Harold, haven't you?
A neighbor asked. Elliot, unable to respond, turned his gaze once more toward the stone faces. That day, the fox seemed to be smiling.